Good morning to our church here in Ringwood, New Jersey, and those on Facebook. We're glad that you're all with us today. And as I was just telling the congregation here, the Lord's been talking to me about faith or fear. The word faith in the Webster's Dictionary is complete trust or confidence in someone or something. The biblical definition is out of Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Fear is to feel a painful apprehension of some impending evil, to be afraid of, to consider or expect with emotions, alarm, something that you really don't want to be around. And as Pastor Jerry said earlier, we don't need faith on a good day. We need faith when things aren't going good. And when is it that life is happening and you let your faith actually kick in? When did you let your faith kick in on the last thing that was going not so good in your life? It might be now. It may have happened a while back. It may be something in the future. But I hate to say this, but something's going to come up where you're going to need your faith. It happens. We have our good days. We have our good months. We have even our good years. But somewhere along the line, we need faith. And it may not be just for us. It might be for a family member. It might be for a friend. It might be for a coworker. So sometimes you need to have your faith kick in so you can help somebody else. The Lord was taking me back quite a few years and reminded me of times I needed faith. Even as young as in third and fourth grade, my father was in an accident. He was supposed to come pick me up from school and never showed up. But my faith back in third and fourth grade is not where it is today. So as you go through things, your faith will grow. I remember going through, and you guys have heard a lot of my past. I'm open up here with you about what's going on. But when my dad I must have been in high school, my dad had a mental illness. We spent time in conferences and in counseling. I, at that time, was probably trying to live on my mother's faith. But you can't do that. As you're watching it with your dad who's got a mental illness, you don't know what else to do. Or the time that my grandmother came to live with us and she was hooked on drugs. They had put her on so many prescription drugs that they had to send her to our house to live, and we had to get her off the drugs. When you're going through that with someone on drugs, you need faith because it's not a normal situation. You aren't living day to day. What about my brother, who's the alcoholic, was the alcoholic? How many Christmases, holidays were ruined because my brother would show up on those days. My first marriage, when my husband left me and just got up and said, I don't love you, see you later. You know, we all have situations like that. They may not be to the extreme of some of mine. And I try not to dwell on those past things. But you know, that past builds your faith when you come through it. So no matter what you're going through, God is going to bring you through it. You're not going to stay there. So are you going to live in faith, or are you going to live in fear of what the future holds? While we're in it, sometimes that fear tries to take hold of us, and sometimes we let it take hold of us. And we need to get rid of it. Life goes on. And faith isn't only needed in those big instances to me, those were big circumstances that I was going through. Sometimes we need that faith just to pay a bill. Sometimes we need that faith just for it may not be simple, but it's a family situation. But it's big to us. And it doesn't matter how big or how small. Sometimes we need that faith just to get out of bed. Because life has been happening so bad, we can't even get out of bed. But if we hold on to our faith, we can get out of bed and know that we are going to go through whatever we need to go through. We all have choices, but the choice is, how are you going to go through it? Are you going to go through that circumstance with faith? Are you going to go through that circumstance with fear, knowing every time and every minute, every day you get up, you have to face fear instead of facing faith? It's hard. The devil wants to think he has you. The devil is right here on your shoulder, talking in your ear and saying, this circumstance is going to bring you down, and I'm going to be there to be applauded. The devil is not going to be the winner. It's God who is always the winner. In 1 Corinthians 10:13, it says, no temptation, regardless of its source, has overtaken or enticed you that is not common to human experience, nor is any temptation unusual or beyond human resistance. But God is faithful to his word. He is compassionate and trustworthy. Our God is compassionate and trustworthy. So why do we let fear jump into our lives? And I think we've all been there. I don't think it's just me. I think a lot of us have been there where we've let it jump in. God was speaking to me about sharing, and this may seem a little strange, but sharing the story of Esther. How God was so in her life. He wasn't really talked about, but in the story of Esther, God is there. He's behind the scenes, just like he's behind the scenes in your life. You cannot see what God's doing most of the time, and you're wondering, God, are you really there? What's going on? Life doesn't seem like it's going the way it's supposed to. But God is behind the scenes. He's not going to pop up and say, hey, I'm here. Watch me do this big miracle. He wants to be the one that is glorified. He wants to be the one that comes through for you. He's not going to give you every detail up front. If he did, you'd probably run away anyhow, because it would be so overwhelming that you wouldn't know how to handle it. In the story of Esther, it starts out, she's living with, let's back up. Before Esther comes on the scene, Queen Vashti is married to King Ahasuerus, and he's a big deal. But the Queen Vashti disobeys her husband, and he has her taken off the throne. So now it's time to look for a new queen. So his friends tell him, get rid of the old one, let's get on with the new one. And sometimes that's what life is. Let's forget about what's happening. Let's just put it in the background, and let's go on to something new. But it wasn't that easy. The friend said, let's put out a decree. Let's look for those young, beautiful virgins. We'll bring them all to the king, and we'll let him have a choice for the new queen. Well, the problem was they gathered up all these beautiful young women, and they brought them to the palace. Esther is beautiful, and she's young, and she's taken to the palace. But she is Jewish. And that's a problem, because they're living in Persia, where the Jewish people were not respected. So when she got taken over there, she had to hold her identity. And it starts out in Esther 2, verse 7. She was raised by Mordecai, her uncle. And it says, and Mordecai had brought up Hadash, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So as his own daughter, he was training her up in the ways of God, because Mordecai knew God. In verse 8, so when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, Esther was taken to the king's palace in the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. She, along with all these other women, girls, young girls, I should say, not women, girls, were taken away from their families and taken and prayed. And they each wanted to be the queen. To them, that sounded great. But they went through all these beauty treatments and all this training to be, I call it, queenly. And only one can make the queen. The rest of them are going to be sent away to the harem, just as I call it leftovers. You know, but God has a plan. And in verse 9 it says, now the young woman pleased him, Esther, and she obtained his favor. She was readily given the beauty treatments besides her allowance. Then she was given 7 choice maidservants were provided from the king's palace, and he moved her to the maidservant, to the best place in the palace. Esther has already got God's hand on her. She came in with all these young women, but God's hand is on her. His protection is on her. She's already found favor because she's already started with the best beauty treatment. She's already been given maidservants, and she's already been moved into the palace, a good spot. Favor is gaining approval, special benefits or blessings. As Pastor Jerry said earlier, we can have God's favor. And that's what we need to believe for. Not just Esther believing for God's favor, because she had a future at stake. You each have your future at stake. So why not believe for God's best and for his favor? In verse 11, it talks about her uncles hanging out at the gate. He wants to know what's happening with Esther, because he raised her as like any dad. If you gave your daughter away to someone to raise them, you'd want to know what was really happening behind those closed doors. Mordecai wanted to know what was happening. He hung out, waiting and waiting and listening and listening. While he was waiting and waiting and listening all these many days, he overheard a situation. But prior to that situation being obtained, in verse 15 it says, Esther's going now to see the king. It's her turn to go present herself to the king, to see if she can become that queen. And in verse 15 it says, now when her turn came for Esther, the daughter Abigail, and the uncle Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai the king's eunuch said, and advised her. She obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. Once again, Esther got favor. Once again, she got favor. When she met with the king in verse 17, it says, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight. The king then made a great feast after he put the crown on Esther's head. She went from this little Jewish girl living with her uncle to becoming the queen of Susha or Persia. But now, she's left her family. She cannot go back. She's this Jewish girl, but she can't tell anybody because they don't like the Jewish people. God's hand was on her. He gave her favor through the various things that was going on, the trainings, being picked as queen, being protected while she is queen. In the meantime, Mordecai, as I said, was at the gate. He hears this circumstance going that someone's going to try and kill her husband, the king. You know, it's bad enough when we're going through life and people are backstabbing us and telling lies about us and we're trying to get ahead. It was no different back then. Somebody else wanted to be king. They're trying to get rid of the one king, King Ahasuerus, Esther's new husband. But Mordecai heard that there was a plan to kill him off. And so it became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king. The king's life was spared. The king's life was spared because God made a provision where the information got back, and the 2 men who were going to kill the king off were hung. You know, in your life, it doesn't matter what you're going through. God can turn the circumstances around. It just may look like there's no way out. But God can turn the circumstances around. Here these 2 men were going to try and kill off the king, but God had it revealed. That's favor. That's favor. And when we trust and believe, we can have God's favor also. Mordecai had to trust, and he had no situation or no control on the situation with his Esther being in the kingdom. But he had to trust God. He had to trust. So how many situations do you find yourself in that you have no control over? Are you really trusting, or are you fearing? Do you say, I have trust, and I'm truly trusting God? Or are you saying it with words, but the trust really isn't there? We've all tried it, we've all been there, but it's better when we trust on God. When Mordecai was at the gate and he overheard that the king was going to be killed, I believe that that was God's positioning Mordecai so he could hear what the plans were. God can position people in your life to either help you or hinder. He has it to help you. The devil tries to hinder you. But Mordecai was positioned so he could hear that something was about to happen to the king. What is it you need in your life that you need to be changed around? You need to have God position you somewhere, or someone be positioned around you to help you in your situation. God will do it. God is setting up your future on things that have happened now or happened in the past. You may not know what the future is. I don't know what the future holds. Mordecai did not know exactly what the future held. But he knew his queen, his Esther, was in that castle, in the kingdom, and he had no control on it. He had to trust God. But he knew that God was setting up the future, and he just had to trust God for that. So where are you today? What is going to be happening in the future that you need to hold on to God for? You need to trust. We need to get fear out of our lives. Because we all live in fear at some time or another. Not intentionally, but it's there. And we need to get that out of our lives. In Proverbs 21:30 it says, there is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. God in this story was setting up Queen Esther for a future where she was going to help save the Jewish people. It didn't matter that other people had plans. The plan that God had was not going to be changed because he had the plan. In Isaiah 46:10-11 it says, remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. I made known the end from the beginning, from ancient times. What is still to come, I say, my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. Same thing for your life. God has a plan for your life. He has a purpose for your life. It's not going to change unless you let it and you don't listen to God. But God had a plan for Esther and for the Jewish people, and he was positioning Esther and Mordecai and the Jewish people. God is working on the plans for you, but are you using your faith? Are you trusting? And if you are using your faith and trusting, are you being obedient? Because sometimes we hear what God's saying to us, but we're not obedient. Like when Mordecai was sitting at the gate, he could have chosen not to even told anybody that the king was about to be killed. He had to make a choice. And that's what we have to do every day. The next thing that happens, Haman comes on the scene. And I'm trying to condense this story, so hopefully it's making sense to you. But Haman comes on the scene. He hates Jews. And he has his own plan. He has his own plan. In Esther 3, starting in verse 1, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow and would not pay homage to him. Haman hated the Jewish people. Now here the king has Esther, a Jewish woman, as his wife. Mordecai is Jewish, but Mordecai will not bow to Haman. Mordecai knew that he was not to bow to anyone other than God. And that's the same for us. We are not to bow to anything or anyone but our God. We need to stand for what is right. We need to be in the Word and know what God commands us to do. No compromising. Mordecai was not compromising. He said, I am not bowing. I am not bowing. He knew he could be in trouble, but he was not bowing. Haman was upset with Mordecai because he expected everyone to bow him. Haman had his own plan. He had his plan, and this is the way it should have gone. A, B, C, D. How often do we put our own plan together? Haman thought he had his plan. He was conniving. He was self-centered. He was prideful. He was a liar. He was a briber. That's not a godly person at all. Not a godly person at all. And he wanted to get rid of Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow to him. How often have you been in situations where someone's tried to get you to bend and to move and to do what they want you to do, and you knew it wasn't the right situation? But you had to use your faith. You have to use your faith. God tells you this is the way it's going to be done. You know it's going to be done that way. And it's your life we're talking about, yours and your family's life. It's not just, oh, so I don't do it today. It's not going to affect anybody. If we don't do what we're told, it's going to affect ourselves, our family, and our friends. We need to hear from God, and we need to do what we're supposed to. Haman wanted to get rid of Mordecai. He had his own plan. His own plan. So in chapter 3, verse 9, he goes to the king and he says, if it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they, the Jewish people, be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. Now he's trying to bribe the king with money too. He figures if he bribes the king, he can do what he wants to do. So the king didn't question him, took off his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of the Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you. Do with them what seems good for you. Remember, Haman's an enemy of the Jews. God loves the Jewish people. You do not go against God's people. Haman had no clue, obviously. And he didn't know that Mordecai and Esther were Jewish, but he did not like the other Jewish people, and he wanted to kill him off. So in verse 13 it says, in the letters, the decree were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both the young and the old, little children and women, all in one day. That's strong. You're not only going against God's people, you're a murderer. And Haman thought nothing was wrong with this plan. How often do we go through life and we think what we're doing, there's nothing wrong with it. God won't really know. It's not really in his word. We shouldn't be doing this, but he won't know. You know what? God has a plan. God had the plan for his Jewish people. He still has a plan for his Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And Haman was not going to pull down that plan. And it's the same thing for us. In all your situations, but God. In Esther's situation, but God. Amen. What are you going through right now in your situations that it looks like you cannot get out of whatever's going on? Or your family members cannot get out of what's going on? But God. God can reverse anything. Whatever it is, don't forget God. It's but God. Life can be hard. Life can look bad. But we have a God who loves us. And if we truly trust him and don't have that fear that we walk around in sometimes, we can get our situations turned around and reversed. God is good. So when the decree goes out, it goes out because Haman gets it out there. He gets it to every province. Everybody is hearing it. Not just the Jewish people, but picture all the others, the neighbors, the friends, the people who love their Jewish neighbors. When the decree goes out, there's mourning, there's wailing. And Mordecai tears his clothes and puts on a sackcloth. Life is looking hopeless for the Jews. Life looks hopeless for us sometimes. And if it's not right now, it may have been in the past and you've come out of it. Praise God. But life happens, and it's still happening. Think of the people in Ukraine right now. It's got to be terrible for them over there. Those people's only hope is in God. And we have things happening in our country. Our only hope is in God. Life can look hopeless. But we need to keep our eyes on God and not on our situation. So often it's hard not to look at our situation. It seems like it's right here. But the more you look at your situation, the closer it gets to you. And the more you look at it, the more you dwell on it. And sometimes we have it so close to us, we can't see God. We're only seeing fear. We need to get that situation back out, past our arm's length, so it's away from our eyes so close. And let's look up to God and depend on God, just like Mordecai did. Mordecai knew that Esther could get to the king, so he got the decree to her. In chapter 4, verse 8, it says, he gave the copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given in the Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, so that he might command her to go into the king to make a supplication to him and plead before him and for her people. Mordecai thought he had it figured out. I'll just tell her to go, and she could just go before the king. You don't just go before a king. You have to be called. You have to be, the royal scepter's got to be laid out to you. If not, you can be killed. So even Mordecai thought he had his plan. I'll just give it to Esther. She'll take care of it. Life doesn't happen like that for her or for us. So they went back and forth a little bit. In verse 10 it says, and Esther spoke to Hattash and gave him command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except for the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, and they may live. Yet I myself, this is Esther, have not been called to go see the king in more than 30 days. Esther wasn't sure that she'd even be accepted into his kingdom, into his royal palace where he was, because he lived separate from her. She could have been killed. But Esther went ahead and put her life on the line because she believed that she would hear from God. And she had told people, her maidservants, to fast and pray before she went into the king. And that's what we need to do. Before we are in a situation, we need to fast and pray. We don't just go forward and say, this is what I think I'm going to do today. We need to go to God first, fast and hear from him, and then go forward with what God has told us to do. So in verse 14, it says, for if you remain completely silent, this is her uncle saying, at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your family's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai is telling Esther, you may not listen to what the Lord is telling you to do, but if you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. So you better pray, basically, and hear from God, because if you're the one that's going to save the Jewish people, God's going to watch over you. God's going to protect you. Same for you. When you go to God and he tells you to do something, it may not make any sense at all, But if God tells you to do it, you are protected, and he will walk with you through it. But you have got to do it if God tells you, and believe in him. So Esther ended up going into the kingdom, into the king, and the royal scepter was held out to her. She was able to advise him that she needed to spend time with him. She needed to talk to him about something. And he says in chapter 5, it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes. And she didn't just go in looking unqueenly. She got dressed up, okay? So that probably helped her be impressed by with the king. And stood in the inner courts of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight, and the king held out his golden scepter. There's that favor again. That's God's favor. She has found favor so many times. Just like you can find favor more than once. Favor is not just for today. You can have favor tomorrow. You can have favor next week. And that's what we see with Esther. She is finding favor in the various situations. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom." That's a big deal. Give her half the kingdom. All she wanted to do was meet with him, though, so she can tell him that there was a plan to kill off the Jewish people. We find favor in our different situations. That's when we trust God. I had one just happen the other day. I'm having to get a new fence put in my house in West Milford here. I go up to the zoning department, and I'm told, you need a survey for your property. So I looked at Pastor Jerry and said, "Where do I find my survey?" I have no clue. It's been years since I bought that house. We went to the safe deposit box, no survey. We looked through everything, no survey. And I'm thinking, I don't want to spend the money for a surveyor to come out here and measure for another fence. So I'm in the zoning department. God's favor. The gentleman there says to me, "You need a survey." And so I quickly did that female thing. Came up with talking quickly and explaining why I don't have it. I moved to Oklahoma. I don't have it, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I just went on and on. Everything's in storage. I have no access to that. We live here. It's in storage. I can't get to. What am I going to do? I mean, I just did that female thing. But you know what? It worked. But that was God. It wasn't me. You can do the female thing, but you need God too. And the gentleman says to me, "Well, look at this plot plan from the fence that you got from the fence company. I think I'll just use that." God gave me the right person at the zoning department. God put me there at the right time, and I had favor. I've been back there a second time. They took that diagram. It wasn't a survey, but it was a diagram that I believe God said, "I'll let you use this. You've got the favor." That's what Esther was getting. Where do you need your favor today? Believe that God has favor. And it's not just favor. Like when she was Esther was having the dinner or the drinks and stuff with the king, he invited Haman. Well, then they got too drunk. She also had to have wisdom. And in our different situations, we need wisdom sometimes. In Proverbs 2, verse 5, it says, "For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding." I believe God gave Esther wisdom to know that she could not share with the king at that time about the plan to kill off the Jewish people. So when she realized that she couldn't do it, she offered him another night. "My request is to meet with you another night." And so that's what he did. They arranged it so they'd come back again. And God arranges everything for us. Amen. Everything. Now Haman's ecstatic because he was the only one invited with the king and the queen Little did he know that he would be the one eventually being reprimanded, should we say. But God knew this. God does reversals. When we have real faith and trust in God, we can look for the miracles and we can look for the reversals. If you don't live in fear, or if you do live in fear, the devil will keep you from seeing the miracles and the possibilities. In Esther 6, 1-4, it says, the night the king could not sleep, so he was commanded to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bethana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Mordecai never got rewarded for basically saving the king's life. That went on for quite a while. Never got rewarded. But you know what? God brings things back to our remembrances, and I believe that's what he did to the king, that he was reminded in his sleep that Mordecai had never been rewarded. So he goes out into the courtyard, and who does he run into? This lovely Haman who hates the Jews. So he says to Haman, what would you do for someone that needs to be rewarded? Well, of course, Haman thinks it's him, Mr. Prideful, Mr. Liar, Mr. Bribery. And he goes through this whole list of great things that he thinks should be done for himself. But as we go to Esther 6, verse 10, Haman finds out the reward is not for him, it's for Mordecai, the man he hates. You know, that's reversal. That's God's hand. Haman had it planned out that he would be rewarded, but God had it planned out that Mordecai would be rewarded. So in verse 10 it says, and the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gates. Haman had to be mortified. He had to be so upset that he gave all these great ideas, and now he has to honor this Jewish person, the Jewish man that he hates. That's God. God will take care of your situations. You just have to remember that. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. You know, Haman was disturbed, and then he went home and he complained to his wife and to the friends. Is that what we do sometimes when life doesn't go right? We go away and complain to people? Well, that's what Haman did. Haman didn't realize that his time was coming to an end. But God had the plan. And Haman's life was going to be ending, and Mordecai and Esther and the Jewish people were being lifted up. And that's what God can do for each of you. Your life is not ending, it's just starting. You have God, you have things to look forward to, no matter what's going on. Just remember, only God can do the reversals. If God has put a plan into motion, the devil cannot pull it down unless you let him. If you're living in fear and you let that devil in, no telling what could happen. But if you're looking to God and you're truly trusting, God can do the reversals. It's only God. Mordecai ends up being killed because they find out that he's the one who was trying to annihilate the Jews. The king changes the whole scenario, or God changes the whole snenario. Esther finds favor with the king again. And in Esther chapter 8, verse 5, it says, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in the sight, and the thing seems to be right to the king, I am pleasing in his eyes. And it is written to revoke the letters delivered by Haman, the son of the Hammeth, Amenhotep the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. Esther is now asking the king to reverse that decree to kill all the Jewish people. He's now found out that Esther is Jewish too. But you cannot just change decrees. Once a decree has been set, that's it. But Esther asks that it be reversed. It cannot be reversed by the king. But what King says in verse 7, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther, and this is another reversal, he had given Esther the house of Haman after he was killed off. So where Haman was living, now the Jewish woman is going to be having that house. That's God's favor. And they have hung Haman on the gallows because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. You deserve to write, you yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. We have so many reversals here. We went from Haman trying to kill all the Jewish people to Haman being killed. We have Haman's estate, should we say, being given to a Jewish woman. Now Mordecai comes and gets to write the decree to save the Jewish people. Those reversals only God can do. Only God. The devil's a liar. What he thinks is going to happen, he's trying to convince you. Don't live in fear. When you have fear creeping in, it's so easy. But when fear is creeping in, you can't let God work. Mm-hmm. Because you're only hearing the devil, you're not hearing God. You can't hear two voices at the same time. You need to be like Mordecai and Esther, who had been brought up with God. And they were hearing from God, and they were obedient. It took a while to get there. Your change in your story may not happen today. Whatever your story is. But God will work with you. But get rid of the fear. Look to God. We must choose God, not fear. I'm reading a book right now. It's called Faith, Farming, and Family. And it talks about a city girl who married a farmer. Whole different world for her. And then we're talking the farm where you're living the farm. Everything is the farm. You don't go to the store to buy the groceries. And for her, it was a whole new life because she'd go to church. They'd go to the store and buy the groceries. After she gets married and on this farm with the two kids, life is dependent on rain, on seed, on harvesting, and for all the crops to survive, and even the price of the crops. And year after year, things were not going very good. And she said, I had to kick my faith into a different gear. You need to kick your faith into a different gear. And then she says, quoted from her, the thing about faith is that it isn't easy and it isn't always our first reaction. It's a conscious choice in the face of doubt and unbelief. It's a vulnerable yet powerful surrender of ourselves. We have to continually live out our faith and live our faith. We have to put our faith into action. Our mouth have to profess faith, but our actions have to match up. And as a farmer, she realized, coming from the city to the farm, her mouth and her actions were not always matching up. But when her life and their livelihood was on the line, she had to change what she was professing. And she had to actually walk it out. Mm-hmm. Same with Esther. They had to walk it out. Let's save the Jewish people. We may not always see God working, And we may not feel that he's working. But I want you to know that God is working in each of your lives. Every one of you. But you have to wait for him. Be in his time. And know that he has not forgotten you. He sees the situation. He sees every situation. He knows each of you individually. No one of you, hate to tell you, no one more of you is the favorite. We're all God's favorites. So don't think that this person over here is more favorite than you or this one over here. God loves each of you. He knows each of your situations. And you are his favorite. Deuteronomy 31:8. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged. And that's what I want to leave you with today. Don't be discouraged. Don't be afraid. Do not live in fear. Choose God. Let God be the one to direct and guide you. I don't think anything could be worse than what Esther was going through. She was responsible for all the Jewish people. She had to make a decision. If she made the wrong decision, the Jewish people would have been killed and annihilated and gone. Her life was on the line, but she knew it was important to do what God told her to do. So whatever you're going through today, it's important to look to God, have faith in God, and be obedient to God. Don't let that fear creep in. Make the choice today that you're going to live by faith, and not just the word faith, but truly live by faith.
Amen.
Those visiting with us on Facebook, we're glad you joined us today, and we will see you next week.